In fact, I tried to interest one of our main opera houses in hiring me to help with, or just inviting me generally, actually, to help with their bloodstain distribution patterns, to make sure they were completely accurate, but they weren't particularly interested in that. And actually, I don't blame them, because they look really good from where I sit. When you're doing a case, it feels a bit as if you're doing a jigsaw, but you're making the bits as you go along. You're actually making them because they're not there. I must admit, I don't watch much of the CSI thing, but I do watch detective things, particularly the older ones. But I think it's because it's so much more subtle and more complex and more time-consuming and so much more of a team effort, a collegiate sort of endeavour than you ever see on those programs. It's all one marvellous person who could just do absolutely everything. I think I counted 7 jobs when I last tried to think how many they were doing.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us on Data Malarkey today is Professor Angela Gallop, CBE, the forensic scientist's forensic scientist. Over the past 4 decades, the teams that she's led have solved some of the most complex, difficult and intransigent cold murder cases in British criminal history. Rachel Nickell on Wimbledon Common, Roberto Calvi under Blackfriars Bridge, and Damilola Taylor in Peckham, and perhaps most famously or notoriously of all, Stephen Lawrence, stabbed by a gang of racist thugs on the streets of Eltham. The details of how Angela and her teams have cracked these cases, often bringing pioneering new techniques into play, are recorded, if I may, in forensic detail in all manner of media. They're in Angela's 2019 book, When the Dogs Don't Bark, her 2022 book, How to Solve a Crime, and any number of TV documentaries and specials. Most recently, this included the 3-part ITV1 series, Cold Case Forensics, in February of this year. Not to mention Angela's appearance on the legend that is BBC Radio 4's Desert Island Discs last November. Angela, first of all, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thank you very much, Sam. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, I trust that's a decent summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything that I've got wrong?
No, I think it's pretty much how I've been spending my time. I think I've also been, I suppose I might say, I've also been involved in setting up and running forensic science laboratories. So while a lot of what I've been doing is casework, absolutely, there's been a lot of that kind of stuff as well. So I've had to be a bit more diverse than perhaps I would have liked, actually. But anyway.
We will definitely come to that a little bit later. I think we really must start meeting like this, as some of our listeners will know and have seen or heard. I interviewed you on stage at the Brighton Summit at the University of Sussex only last Friday. But before we talk about data and the way that you use data in forensics, let's go beyond the day job and ask you an opening question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. Can you tell me, Angela, how do you spend your time?
I'm trying to spend less time doing forensic science. It's been an absolute passion of mine since I discovered it in the mid-1970s. And it gradually took over my life to the point where it was just dismissing all of my hobbies and all of the things like that I used to enjoy. And I'm trying to get them back again at this advanced stage of life. And so I still have a lot of forensics going on, trying to cut it down, but I still have a lot of that going on. But aside from that, I've always been very keen on plants, very respectful and admiring of plants, and particularly big plants, trees and things like that, and just a miracle how they work. So I'm very keen on gardening. And I also love to spend time at the opera. I discovered it late, and I think I'm desperately still trying to catch up a few years later. And so I just love the combination of music and drama that you get with really good opera.
And perhaps the occasional murder as well.
What do you mean? I certainly don't commit any.
I mean, on stage, occasionally an opera may have a murder.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they have all sorts of things. I mean, anything emotional, they have buckets of. So completely. In fact, I tried to interest one of our main opera houses in hiring me to help with. Or just inviting me generally, actually, to help with their bloodstain distribution patterns, to make sure they were completely accurate, but they weren't particularly interested in that. And actually, I don't blame them, because they look really good from where I sit, and actually it does the job. So why on earth would you want to nitpick about anything? Anyway.
Very good. Now, the grandfather of modern forensics, if we can call him that, the French criminologist Edmond Locard, is famous for saying that every contact leaves a trace. In the Stephen Lawrence episode of the Cold Case Forensics program earlier this year, your brother Jonathan suggested that you might have got a taste for crime from sneaking a peek at the lurid tales in the now-defunct Sunday newspaper, The News of the World. Is this another case of every contact leaves a trace? Was it really the News of the World that got you into forensics?
Well, I think my family are quite convinced that that's where I developed my interest in this sort of stuff. Actually, I was much more interested in the chocolate bars that went with it. I mean, I was quite keen on the people and the news of the world and all of that sort of thing, and it was a bit of an eye-opener, and I suppose I grew up a bit reading some of it. But mainly when I went there with my father, first of all, and then my eldest brother later on, chocolate, and particularly a bar of Cadbury's Flake, was actually, one of the main reasons for going. Because you get chocolate bars, obviously, where you get newspapers.
Absolutely. Now, you at school, was there an inspiration at school who got you into science, first of all? A teacher who got you into science, first of all?
Yes, just in the nick of time. I had been absolutely abysmal at school. I had thoroughly enjoyed it, loved the social side of it, and just about managed to scrape along, but never did any work, never saw the point of learning anything much. I mean, every now and again there'd be something quite interesting, but really nothing to fire me up and get me really wanting to learn, until I got into the sixth form. And I only just scraped through there, but I got into the sixth form, introduced to this marvellous woman who taught me botany, and she was I don't know what she did, but somehow she switched on this whole idea of, actually it's quite good fun to learn things. And when you know things, you can do more and you can think more, and it's all more exciting. And she pressed this switch in me. And from then on, everything was fairly straightforward. And I've never had a problem picking up a book since. So it was quite incredible, and happened over a very short space of time, because I got I got 3 quite creditable A-levels as a result of her inspiring me in other areas as well, not just in her area. So it was fine, and went to university and did well there. And the rest, what happened next.
Well, I mean, your PhD was on the biochemistry of chloroplasts in sea slugs, I think I'm right in saying. That seems quite a stretch from sea slugs to forensics. So how was it that you ended up in the Home Office Forensic Science Service?
I had a very enjoyable 3 years doing my bits of research, my research degree. And I was coming to the end of it, and I was thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And I think that I was thoroughly convinced by then that I needed to be an applied scientist. I couldn't any longer sit in the corner of a laboratory doing things that were quite interesting to me, but with a very small audience. I think there were only about 6 or 7 people around the world who would have been at all interested in what I was finding. And I felt that I needed to be doing stuff which is more important to greater numbers of people than that. And of course, doing something socially worthwhile and worthy is always a good thing and always attractive. But I hadn't thought of forensic science. It was a friend of mine. I mean, I'd just been bellyaching about, I didn't think academia was going to be for me. And just saying, what on earth am I going to do? And it was he who came across the library one day, and he said, "Hey, Angela, have a look at this ad. It's it's advertising jobs in the Forensic Science Service." And I don't think I was even aware of the Forensic Science Service, really. I must have known about forensic science generally, but, that was about it. Anyway, I thought, well, this sounds good. This is definitely an important way to spend your time. And, sort of thing I could be quite interested, could be quite an interesting job. So I applied with no real thought that I would get anywhere. And I remember my tutor at university saying, he said, "Well, there'll be lots of people applying. I don't know how easy it will be to get in." But amazingly, and even though I think that I didn't answer the questions I was asked particularly well, it must have been all right, because I did actually get offered a job, and then started off in the forensic science service. And in those days, it existed. It doesn't exist today. But they had a laboratory in Harrogate, and I'd been so happy in my first university at Sheffield that I thought Yorkshire was the place to be. And so I went off to Harrogate and to discover all about it.
Now, you mentioned already that you have not only been working on cases throughout your career, but you've also built and grown and sold a number of companies. Is it fair to say that there was a glass ceiling that you hit your head on inside the Forensic Science Service? Question one. And question two, it seems quite a brave thing to have done, to have set up a private forensic science business. What gave you the confidence you could succeed with that?
Well, in reply, because I'm a forensic scientist, we're going to be very going to stick to the order of the questions here. But anyway, first of all, I don't know about and now, you see, having done that introduction, I've forgotten what your first question was. What was it about the Forensic Science Service?
Glass ceiling?
Glass ceiling, thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. Yes, they had the Home Office had taken on quite a number of people when I joined, and then quite a number of people beyond that, trying to build it up, trying to meet the increasing demand. The science got sort of slightly more powerful and could do more things and provide more useful information. It had been, the police wanted more of it, and so it had expanded, and they were investing in it hugely. But of course, it came to the point where they had to stop doing that and think a bit more deeply about what they were doing. Otherwise, it would have just gone on forever, I think. And so we had a glut of people who were about my age in the service, and that meant that it was, quite difficult to find areas where one could advance and learn new skills and become something slightly different. And so I was getting a little frustrated with that. And I remember I went to London to see the controller of the service and just said, I think I'm going to have to leave. I don't want to particularly, but there's just nowhere for me to go. And she, for it was a she then, which was really good, she said, well, it's a real shame, but I don't know what I can offer you. I don't know what I can do. We are in this situation. They've stopped all promotions now for we don't know how long. And so that's the situation. So that was really what made me think, well, there are many, many reasons why I decided to go off on my own, but that was certainly one of the main ones. And so that was that. And I suppose it was a big step. But somehow in everything I've done, I've always had this amazing confidence. I've got no idea why or quite where that comes from. I just, perhaps a lack of imagination or something, I don't know. But I just decide that I'm going to do something needs doing. I'm going to do it. I will be fine. I've got good, I know good people who can help me. I think I can persuade them to do that. And I just charge ahead, and I've done that on a number of occasions. I've just, whereas I'm not particularly confident in other areas of life, I seem to be thunderingly confident in relation to this. And indeed, it all worked out like that, sometimes with some rather, breath-holding moments in the middle. But it the people that I've known and worked with have been utterly brilliant, and have been incredibly supportive and, just generally wonderful. And so I had a relatively straightforward time, if I could begin to call it that, throughout my career, but because of that.
And let's focus on this podcast, after all, is called Data Malarkey. Let's focus on data and facts and evidence. Can you describe what kinds of data that you've used in your career to solve crimes, and perhaps how this has changed over the course of your career? I'm thinking particularly about the growing importance of both DNA and digital evidence.
Well, I mean, as a forensic biologist, which is where I started, I've always been very interested in blood and other body fluids, and not just identifying them and sort of categorizing them, trying to find out who they could and couldn't have come from, but also looking at the patterns that they form, because they can be amazingly helpful at crime scenes or bloodstains on or potential offenders' clothing and so on. And so patterns are critical. And then weapons and damage to clothing, damage to all sorts of things, but certainly that. And then sort of connected with that, and because we are dealing mainly with crimes, what we used to be called offences against the person. So crimes where people get hurt, basically, and people wear clothing. And so when they've been in contact with each other, beating each other up or whatever it might have been, then their clothing comes into contact. And so it's looking for the transfer of the tiny fragments of textile fibres that break off as you wear your clothing, and then are available for transfer from the surface of one item of clothing to another if there's contact between two people wearing them. And then more broadly, of course, I mean, once you extend it out into, what other people in the laboratory do, because there are lots of expertise and skills applied to forensics. There's the toxicologists, there are people who deal with drugs of abuse, there are the chemists who deal with marks of all kinds, fingerprints, but footwear marks and manufacturing marks, tool marks when people jemmy open windows, all that sort of thing, and tiny chemical traces like sort of paint and glass and a whole host of other things. And then fires and firearms and explosions and question documents if someone's questioning a will or, some signature on something or, whatever it might be. There's all of that. And now, of course, as you say, we have all these digital traces that we're able to use as, or look for forensic traces, forensic evidence that someone's, been in contact with someone and where they were when it happened and all the rest of it. So really powerful digital evidence if you get to it quickly enough. And CCTV, of course, is really critical too. But I think, I think there have been advances, it has changed a lot since I joined the Forensic Science Service in 1974. We were grouping blood and body fluids then. Now we have DNA, which is just, I can't tell you, it must be the biggest thing in forensic science, I think, because now instead of being rather pleased when we've got a bunch of groups that enable us to say, oh, well, this blood could have come from one in a few thousand people if we're lucky. Now, if we get a full DNA profile, we say it's come in, it's 1 in a billion. I mean, it's just, orders of magnitude different. So extremely powerful. And we have DNA databases now that we can use. National DNA databases, incredibly handy. So we have all of that going on. But I mean, there have been advances across the board. I mean, there are more powerful instruments these days, so we can analyze smaller traces of things. We can identify them very quickly. We've got built-in libraries in our machines. We can batch samples and run them overnight, so things are quicker and cheaper than they used to be for the police. So there have been advances right across, as you would expect, right across the spectrum of different sorts of tests that forensic scientists apply. But the other thing that's happened as well, and I think particularly when we got into being able to do cold cases in the way that we do them now, and largely through DNA, but through other things as well. But there have also been huge developments in the approaches that are taken to investigating old cases. We've learned an enormous amount about, what's a good thing to do and what's a bad thing to do, and what's necessary, what's unnecessary. And all the issues around, if you've got a very old case, being very careful that what you find now is the result of some sort of contamination over the years. So we've got very skilled at that. So lots of developments in understanding and devising better ways of investigating cases with the tools that we have than simply just the technology itself.
There's a number of things in what you've just been saying over the last few minutes that lead me to ask you this question about the small and tiny amounts of evidence that you're able to build a case from, about different techniques and methodologies and DNA. Could you tell us briefly, if it's possible to do so briefly, about the evidence that you and your team found that led to the prosecution of Stephen Lawrence's killers? And as I understand it, that's evidence that was overlooked several times before you ever got to the case.
Yes, it's interesting that, I mean, we had learnt by the time that we started to reinvestigate the Stephen Lawrence case that one thing that was critical was to go back to the crime scene, or get an idea of the crime scene as firmly as you could in your head, so you knew what the sequence of events was likely to be, because that helps very much in, determining what you look for and what on and things. So we would have done that to begin with. And one of the things that we noticed in some of the witness statements was that people were suggesting that Stephen might have been struck, perhaps with an iron bar, before he was actually killed with the use of a knife. But it looked as though there might have been a bar might have been involved of some sort. And the police had recovered a piece of scaffolding pole from a nearby garden near the scene of the attack. And so we started, strangely, looking at that, discovered it had paint on it, as fairly brightly coloured paint, as you often find on scaffolding poles. And we thought, well, if that has been used and then just chucked away afterwards, we'll have a look for some of that paint on in Stephen's hair and on the upper part of his clothing, on his shoulders of his jackets and that sort of thing. And so we started with that, and we didn't find anything. But what we did notice was that there were quite a lot of red fibres on the surface of his clothing. And so we thought, that's interesting. Because basically at the beginning, everything's interesting because you don't know what you're doing. But then we had a look at the clothing he was wearing on the night in question. He was wearing about 6 layers of it because it was a cold night. And several layers down, he had a red polo shirt on, and so we looked at the red fibres, and sure enough, they matched. There were two different kinds, polyester and cotton, and they matched the constituents of this polo shirt. And while that wasn't interesting in itself, because obviously they'd come from his own clothing, what it did tell us was, well, here's something that we could look for. It's fairly easy to find because it's bright red, but we could look for on the clothing of the suspects, because the police had a number of suspects right from the very start, and we were interested in them along with anybody else that the investigation might throw up. And almost immediately we started finding fibres that matched the constituents of polo shirt. And so we thought, well, that's interesting. Might just be coincidence, but it's interesting. Let's just think about what happened in relation to textile fibres. Let's now look at that. We'll forget about paint because we're not finding any paint. We'll home in on fibres. And one of the things that had happened is that the search for textile fibres had been fairly, it had been very extensive in one way, but really it had all been looking at fibres in one direction. Fibres that could have been left by the suspect's clothing on Stephen's clothing, because Stephen collapsed fairly quickly and nothing much happened to his clothing, whereas the suspects ran off, and then goodness knows what they did, and what they did with their clothing and so on. And so the focus was all very much on that transfer of these tiny fibre fragments I've talked about in that direction. And so we thought, well, this is interesting. We're finding, that there are these red fibres available, red fibres transferring possibly to a couple of the suspects. Let's look for more fibres like Stephen's clothing on the suspect's clothing. And we started to find other things as well. And in the end, we found 4 different kinds of fibres that matched from different parts of his clothing. And the chances of getting exactly the same sort of fibre on someone else's clothing, it's sort of, it's pretty interesting, even if you only got one kind. But when you got 4 kinds, it's quite persuasive. And then in looking for more fibres, we thought, well, what else can we do with, what other samples can we sort of kind of create. I don't want to use the word create, but what other samples can we can find? And so we ended up brushing out the insides of the bags in which all of these items had been stored in. And that gave us some more textile fibres to look through. But critically, it gave us a tiny flake of blood. And of course, that's what we'd really been, interested in anyway, because, but rather like looking at fibres in only one direction, it had always been assumed, and I think we'd thought that this was probably the case, that because Stephen had just two cuts in his, just two stab cuts, and because he was wearing so many layers of clothing, and clothing is essentially self-cleaning so far as knives are concerned, as they're withdrawn through the clothing, then we thought, well, maybe we're not going to, we're not going to find any blood on any of the suspects, because, why would there be any left, and especially dripping off the end of the blade? Why would there be any of that? So we were slightly surprised to find this flake, but, very interested in it, obviously, and particularly because encased in it were two fibres of a fifth type that could have come from Stephen's clothing, from his cardigan. And so now we had 5 different sorts of fibres. So, very strong evidence in relation to textile fibres. And when we did DNA profiling on the blood in the flake, of course, it matched, well, I say of course, but it matched Stephen Lawrence's DNA. Then, of course, we had to find out where the flake might have come from. It wouldn't have landed as a flake in the bag. It must have come off the jacket that was in the bag. So we had a look all over the jacket. We'd already searched it. The Forensic Science Service scientists had searched it. We'd all had a look and hadn't found any blood because it was so tiny. And there was this tiny little stain left on the jacket in the back of the neck, which is actually is not an unlikely place to find it from from an assault of this kind. And so we quickly DNA profiled that, and that gave us the same result. It matched Stephen's DNA. And so that was how the evidence emerged. At the same time, we had noticed on the clothing that there were lots of tiny little hair fragments, as if people had had haircuts. It's that kind of hair that we were finding, and we searched through those, and we found one, possibly 2 hairs, but one hair in particular, which we were able to test, which on one of the suspects' item of suspect's clothing, which could have come also from Stephen. We did a bit more DNA of a rather different kind, and got a result that matched his DNA with that. So in the end, we ended up with, quite a number of textile fibres. We ended up with some DNA evidence, and we ended up with some hair evidence as well. So from nothing, it was amazing. But we had to go on quite a journey to find it. And then, of course, we had to do an enormous amount of work at the end to make sure that it couldn't have got there through some sort of contamination, because these items had been examined by a number of different scientists in different locations over the years. And so we had to be really careful that couldn't explain it either. But so that was a big piece of work.
What an extraordinary story. And sort of so little evidence, but piecing it together, both in really taken by the way that you talk about both the physical artifacts, but actually also what might have happened. I want to ask you a question about technology is always emerging. You've talked about DNA and digital traces and so on. Do you have a view about the sudden emergence of AI tools that are available to anybody? Do you think that artificial intelligence tools will make subsequent generations of forensic scientists able to do even more powerful analyses?
I think that it will do. I'm not quite the person to ask, but I think, from what I can see sitting from where I sit, I'm quite sure it will be able to take the drudgery out of a lot of things. I think it will give them ideas which they might, and create links which it might take them a lot longer to find by themselves. So I think there's lots of ways in which it can help. I think that you've always got to be careful. Well, but I think this may just reflect my knowledge of AI at the moment. But I think you've got to be careful that you don't rely on it too much, and you allow humans to develop their, their sort of imagination, and allow them to be able to suggest, well, I know we'd normally do that, but why don't we just do that, do something really left field? But maybe, AI, I'm sure, will be doing left field before very long, probably is already, but, I would hate us to miss something just because we've given it all to a machine to process. I want us to keep that, because it's sometimes those flashes of inspiration that you get, which lead you to being able to understand something better, or find something, or, choose which particular bit of it to test, or whatever it might be. And at the moment anyway, I think we have to be careful about how we relinquish the job to AI. But I'm sure that it will be, on the whole, extremely helpful, just like it will be in so many other industries.
I think you're absolutely right about not relinquishing. And one of the things, there's a professor at NYU, New York University, Cole Moshe, who talks about the how brilliant AI is at convergent thinking, at boiling the corpus of what we knew online until September 21. Brilliant at that, but rubbish at divergent thinking and moving from data to insight.
That's really what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what tools and techniques do you use to move from often incomplete data to genuine insight?
I think when you're doing a case, it feels a bit as if you're doing a jigsaw, but you're making the bits as you go along. You're actually making them because they're not there. So I think that it's a way of working. First of all, you've got to start by developing a really good strategy for investigation, and that's based on a really good understanding of what's actually happened. Because lots of people will say, oh yes, we know what happened at the crime scene, this is where they came in, this is what they did, and they left through that door, or whatever it might be. But actually you need much, much more, and a much better understanding, more detailed understanding than that, if you can get it. And particularly, where it concerns assaults and things like that, you want to have a very precise sequence of events, because that will help you with the type of contact and, where you'd likely to find evidence of contact on things and on people and all the rest of it. So you need to do that. And then I think it's about picking the best opportunities to find something that's going to be really useful. It comes from that. And there are lots of things, being very careful, when you test something, to actually look at the results, because lots of scientists look at it quickly and, they're pressed for time. And particularly if something's just happened and they think, oh yes, there's nothing really there, and then move on to something else. We've got to really just see if there's something just lurking underneath the surface. Be very careful about that. And if you do find something, you need to be digging around it. So I think it's a more of approach. I think I'm talking about an approach rather than anything else. But you've got to dig around that spot to see if you can find any more. And if you find something, then if you're on the right track, you are likely to find more different things, supporting evidence. So it's very important to realise that. And looking for patterns and trends in evidence as well. I know there's one case that I worry about, that I'm worrying about it because while the evidence is there and it's strong, it doesn't form the right sort of pattern. You'd expect other things that aren't there. And so, that's worrying. And I think I've learned too that if you're going to do these investigations, and if they're going to be lengthy, if they're really complex, you need to take the investigators or commissioning investigators with you, or they'll stop funding you too soon. You won't be able quite to get there. So I've learned all about that. So I don't know whether you'd call those tools and techniques, but anyway, those are some of the things that we think about when we're going through this to try and make sure that our investigations are a success.
Now, I've heard you say more than once that real forensics is much more interesting and dramatic than the CSI series that dominate on TV. Why do you say that?
Well, I must admit I don't watch much of the CSI thing, but I do watch detective things, particularly the older ones. But I think it's because it's so much more subtle and more complex and more time-consuming and so much more of a team effort, a collegiate sort of endeavour than you ever see on those programs. It's all one marvellous person who could just do absolutely everything. I think I counted 7 jobs when I last tried to think how many they were doing, which is unbelievable. I think she's fantastic, but not very real. And so I think that's it. And I think, then that it's the whole business about working out what's happened. So you've got a starting point, going through masses of stuff. And you never see this on television. You never see the mounds of, clothing or whatever it is, sometimes quite grotty, that one has to go through in order to find tiny traces of something or other, and how you do that. You don't see it. You just see wonderfully clean lab benches, which of course is how they start every time, but very soon they get covered with things, but you don't see that. And finding something completely unexpected which throws you off course, you don't seem to see much of that, whereas that happens not infrequently really, and you have to work out what it all means because it will need to be explained. And then presenting evidence, and it's not just you go there and talk about it. I mean, some of your audience at court are openly hostile, and you have to deal with all of that, and you don't really see people being beaten up in court in the way that we do fairly routinely. So that's why I think it's different, but why I also think that it's much more interesting in real life. But I'm bound to say that, aren't I?
You almost certainly are. Can you tell me what's the most memorable case of your career, and what was distinctive about the data and information that you used to get to insight for that? I
think I would say the Coastal Path murders, the murder of Gwenda and Peter Dixon on the Pembrokeshire Coastal Path in 1989, I think it was. And the difficulty associated with that, we were, the force didn't have much of a budget to spend on this. It was a very old case when we did it. We were doing it in the 2000s. And they wanted us just to go for the best evidence, go for DNA. And we've learnt that sometimes to find any DNA that might be there, sometimes you have to go and look for something else first, and then that will lead you to the DNA. But anyway, we did exactly as we were instructed, and we looked hard for any DNA on the victims' bodies and on their clothing and so on, but they'd been manhandled a bit, so there were some potential opportunities, and their bodies had been covered up with vegetation to hide them, and so, there were opportunities there too, but we weren't finding any DNA at all. And we had mentioned that we would like to go a little bit wider, but I think the police were, obviously worried about budget. It is really difficult for them, and we all appreciate that. But it came to the point when they got so fed up with us not finding anything that they said, you're absolute rubbish. We're going to take this off you and give it to another team. And of course, that's the rudest thing you can say to a forensic scientist. I mean, sometimes it must be necessary, but, anyway. So I remember going down there and having the most difficult conversation, I think, with the police, team of police officers that I've ever had. They were quite forthright, I think you would say. Anyway, I managed at the end of that to persuade them to allow us a little bit more latitude. I said, if we could just look for this. And I think we wanted to look for textile fibres because we were beginning to suspect that whoever had done this might have been wearing gloves, and we wanted to see if there was any evidence of that. And so they were great. They said, okay, go on, have a quick look. And almost immediately we started finding evidence. It was incredible. It sort of fell into our laps. It was absolutely amazing. And we had links not only with this double murder, but with another double murder of a brother and sister who lived in a remote farmhouse. in Wales, very close by, well, quite close by. And this was a tricky case. The house had been set on fire, afterwards. It was really, really difficult, but we managed to find some links with them. Then we found some links with 5 young people who were sexually assaulted at gunpoint. And so we found some links with them as well. And in the end, we had this mass of evidence. And the great thing is that in searching for fibres, very like Stephen Lawrence, actually, this case, in this way, that in searching for fibres, we did actually find a tiny amount of blood on a pair of shorts that had come from the suspect's house. And this matched Peter Dixon. So now we were starting to get the DNA, statistics and everything. So that was absolutely incredible. So we had an amazing amount of evidence at the end from completely nothing, going nowhere, police being irritated with us. And then, as I said, you can unexpected things happen, and they often happen. Then, while we were looking at the short, we went back to the shorts again because they looked a little bit shorter than a photo fit picture of somebody who might have been the assailant at the time. And so we unpicked the hem, which we discovered had been not hand done, but done at home, not manufactured, this hem. And we discovered they'd actually been turned up. And looking inside, we found a little bit more DNA, had a go at that, and found that this was this matched the DNA of the victim's daughter. And so then everybody said, you were doing so well. We were really pleased with you, but now you've really blown it. This is completely preposterous. Go away, do it again, and get a grip. So then we were left with sort of thinking, so we got some help from statistician. We did everything we could. The link seemed to get stronger and stronger with the daughter. So then we thought, come on, we've got to understand this. We've got to go back to the crime scene. When in doubt, go back to the crime scene. So we got all our photographs out. We'd already been to the crime scene, so we knew roughly what it looked like, but we can now imagine it with all these items spread about. Because the Dixons had been on a walk and they had their rucksacks with them, and whoever had done this to them looked as if they'd emptied out the rucksacks, and so there was this clothing strewn around, their spare clothing. And so then from there, we thought, well, if you think about that, you think about what the offender had to do in terms of manhandling these people. Both of them had been shot in the back of the head, so there was a lot of blood about, and then they had been dragged into position, cut with branches and so on. It'd be very likely that they would have got some blood on their own clothing, which might have been obvious to someone who passed them. And so what more natural than to change their clothing for their shorts for a pair of shorts they belonged to the victims, and that would explain it. And this was put to the court. The court accepted that as the most likely explanation. And so this unexpected result we got, far from being unhelpful, actually strengthened the evidence, if it was necessary to do that. But so it was surprising, but we had to work quite hard on that to understand what that could be about. But that seemed to be the most likely thing. So that is why, because of the adversity, I think you could describe it, because of that, in that particular case, what we were up against, and the fact that, we had to carry on, we weren't finding anything, but tenacity is a really important character trait, I think, that you need. But we carried on, and eventually we got there, and it was an amazing case.
I love the narrative arc. I love you've got a double kind of trough of despond in there. A fantastic narrative arc. What a great story. Now, of course, inevitably, I have a Columbo question for you. My Columbo question is this: in the way that you have worked with data, that you work with data now, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you?
I don't know. I think so. You're probably in the best position to know whether you think for me, this is a sort of coming at it from a slightly different angle. I mean, I think as long as I've described how we go about it and the sorts of things that we do, I can't think of anything sort of, particular really that I think you haven't asked.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Angela, for sharing your approach to using data smarter. I think if there were more people with your approach for investigating when the dogs don't bark, there'd be a lot less malarkey in the world of forensic science and a lot more data common sense. Angela Gallop, thank you so much for joining me today. What a fantastic discussion.
Thank you.
As a bit of a podcast extra, I think it's only fair that we should give a reward to our listeners who've stayed with us to the end. I need to give you an extra vote of thanks, as, indeed, my big sister. How amused and how happy our father, Kenneth Guy, Jack Charles Knowles, would have been to hear us talking here today. Thank you to my sister, thank you to our father. You may not have been around for more than 35 years now, but I think it's fair to say that you've cast a long and mostly happy shadow into both of our lives. Here's to Kenneth for being, as Bob Cratchit would say, the father of this feast, though I rather think we might need some gin to toast our shared genes. Thanks again to my sister Angela.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.